Father Ronald Rolheiser is a Roman Catholic priest, theologian, professor, and best-selling author. He has written beautiful and important books on spirituality and systematic theology like Sacred Fire and The Holy Longing, which have sold over 250,000 copies. And most importantly, he is from Saskatchewan, so we must be related in a profound way. Father Ron, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Your book, The Holy Longing, argues something that feels both true and deeply inconvenient, that we are born with this ache, like a longing that never fully goes away. So I wondered if we could start there. Like, what is this ache?
I think it's the most basic thing inside of us. You know, if you allow me to get philosophical just for a minute, remember Descartes' famous line. So Descartes said, "What's the only thing you know that's sure?" He said, "I think, therefore I am." Well, St. Augustine said, no, it's not true. St. Augustine said, the deepest thing is, I desire, therefore I am. Like even before knowledge, we wake up, we're aching. From babies wake up crying, and we never quite stop for the rest of our lives. There's always something missing. And remember Augustine's famous line, which I think all Christians know, but where he says, "You've made us for yourself, Lord. Our hearts are restless till they rest in you." That to me, that's the deepest truth in my life. I think it's the deepest truth in everybody's lives, whether it's recognized or not.
You're sort of stacking up this argument for this being the most basic thing about us. It certainly feels very true to me. I experience it as like a hunger. And I don't know if I would have named that so clearly before I had a pretty terrible experience with cancer. And now it feels very obvious to me that this ache in me feels like this desire to swallow the whole world at the same time.
That ache, like a lot of people, I think spontaneously think it's something that's like a downside to us. But in fact, as Christians, that's the image and likeness of God in us. The image and likeness of God inside is not some icon stamped in you, like a Trinity. It's fire. We have divine fire. We have divine appetites. Now we land on people and things and stuff we love and so on, and that's God-given too. But notice it never stops. Like in your life, I'm sure you've never said, "Well, that's enough." Well, maybe some night when you're tired. But basically, in terms of your life, it's never enough. It's always the next thing, and there's no resting spot.
I guess that's one of the things that irritates me most in terms of the false advertising of being a Christian. Like there's this nothing missing, nothing broken kind of attitude. Like if you're a Christian, you just are never supposed to feel achy again. And you define spirituality instead as what we do with the ache. I wonder if you could unpack that a bit.
One of the weaknesses in Christian spirituality, actually it's not as pronounced in Hinduism or Buddhism, and that is that we don't make enough place for, in popular spirituality, for mourning, for sadness, and so on. We don't give people permission to be sad. An older generation like my parents, growing up Catholic, they had a prayer that they said every day, and in that prayer was a line that said, "For now we live mourning, weeping this valley of tears." Today people say that's morbid. No, it was not. It gave them permission to, make peace with a life that's never full, that's never complete. I also got the line from Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner says, sometime, he said, you realize in life that in this life, there is no finished symphony. Like that. You just never get the complete symphony. You get beautiful symphony. You get beautiful things. There's wonderful things. Life is beautiful. But it's never the complete symphony. Pardon me. It's just, you don't get it, and we feel it in every desire we have.
It's true that, I do think that really, that mode of argumentation where we imagine that spirituality sort of makes us impermeable, like absolutely, it seals every crack. And I usually think of that as one of the first signs of culture warring. Like it means that you've taken faith and made it into a kind of proof and made it attempt to carry water that nobody can. And especially when it comes to playing show and tell with families. I mean, even like since and I really blame the 1970s for a lot of things, but like ever since the 1970s, we have really tried to make families be this performance of nothing missing, nothing broken. And I don't know a woman, I do not know a woman in her 30s and 40s who would say, oh my gosh, at least like that that wasn't the beginning of them realizing, oh my gosh, I think I may have thought this was going to be fixed by now.
Yeah. I think sometimes we just fall into the prosperity gospel where you put on Jesus and you're not going to suffer. And that's not Christianity. That's not what Jesus talks about. Jesus doesn't save us from the pains of life, gives us meaning inside of that. But, the prosperity gospel, like if you had believed in Jesus, you wouldn't have got cancer. Incidentally, Kate, I also have 4-stage colon cancer and I've had it for 11 years and so on. And I guess I didn't believe in Jesus enough, and
Thank you for telling me that. I didn't know that. That is living with chronic cancer. It does, I imagine, make you have to keep answering the same questions over and over again. Like, what exactly are we promised? How good does this get? How does it feel to be loved? And does that help me when at 2 a.m. when I feel scared and actually tired of whatever my body's doing and not doing?
Kate, what it's done for me, because I've been stage 4 for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so that, the doctor parcels out your life in 6 months, come back in 6 months. And then I enjoyed those 6 months. There's something wonderful about, having you're getting 6 good months, and then you go back and, you can get a different sentence and another 6 months and so on. And I find it's a good way to live,
Yeah.
You can't take anything for granted.
I totally agree. I used to have these 2-month scan intervals and then 3 months and then eventually 6 months. And I got really good at the intensity of that sprint feeling and like good at feeling like then the plans I could make inside of that felt they had to be important. They couldn't just be another like garbage faculty meeting. No offense, faculty meetings. Like I did find actually a lot of my questions about this achiness though, and part of why I was looking for your work was, I guess there was a satisfaction though that I started to get into when I felt like I was trying to pour my life into these measuring cups. And then when my scan interval became 12 months, then it sort of started to get fuzzy again with like, what do you do with all this want then? Like, how do you balance the need to have like a sustainable life, sustainable spiritual life, sustainable commitments, like be a nice, boring person. And yet you feel the like urgency to make everything matter in every way.
Yeah. I think that you point to see sometimes when we pat, for instance, you look at what your next scan is going to be like, and then you panic. And then all of a sudden they say, well, Kate, you're good for the next 5 years. And all of a sudden it's like it opens up and life becomes ordinary again. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. You don't have the sharpness, of and you say there's a goodness in that because but there's also there's a danger that we fall asleep a little bit,
Yeah.
That I guess that's what I'm trying to say with scans every 6 months, it keeps you alert. You don't let your guard down. Mm-hmm. And not just so much, like with Jesus and church and so on, but with friendships, with health, with enjoying everything. You have a good glass of wine, say, this is good. I mean, where you just get up in the morning and the fact that you're walking around, you're healthy, you have wonderful work to do and so on. You say, what a privilege. Isn't that wonderful?
Getting to that place of like deepest gratitude. I've struggled a lot with how to manage that push-pull feeling. Like, to be totally honest, that's why when I was describing what I was struggling with, everyone's like, oh, have you read Father Ron? So I'm really glad we're talking. Because I I was better at the short term, everything. You have to only do everything that matters. I have found it harder to feel sort of the regularness of like the aches of living in ordinary. For me, in my life right now, it's like school pickups and grocery lists and, managing, wanting to be ambitious and have a job and blah, blah, blah. But there is this like feeling sometimes that you feel sort of like the accumulated disappointment of all the things that can't be true, all the paths you can't take, all the things that aren't possible. And they usually aren't possible because of good things, because people you love need you. And yet there's all the incompleteness of it that I think that so much of your descriptions about like the ache really points to. And I find that a lot of the answers sometimes about faith are so simplistic, like that praying in a certain way, just being a good person is supposed to somehow diminish that. But you have this like argument about how you think that channeling our spirituality in a certain direction might actually help us process, like not live with quite so much disappointment or resentment or embitteredness.
We're going to die with a lot of unfulfilledness. If you mourn it, you can live with it. If you don't mourn it, it's going to harden you. See, there's a deep spiritual and psychological genius in our lives. Says, I need to mourn this. I can die without being fulfilled, but I can't die with the unfulfillment not being mourned. See, you got to mourn the unfinished symphony. The other part I want to bring in is, the ordinariness. You're not walking on water all the time. You can't live intensity all the time. You go crazy. Plus, it's impossible. We have a lot of evangelicals who come and take our programs now, ministers, and that's part of what they're looking for. They say, we're in a church where we expect people to be high all the time, and you can't do that. Like the whole thing of dark nights and boredom and flatness and so on, and desert, desert spirituality, wilderness.
Yeah.
And, see, that's a deep part of our spirituality. And again, in pop spirituality, you're not given that permission. You're supposed to be high and intense all the time.
Yeah.
Not just
instead of bored and irritated.
Everything. Yeah.
That would be, a more realistic, like devotional book. It would be like, God is totally there when you're very bored with this whole thing. Yeah. God is definitely there while you're extremely irritated.
Yeah. Well, like I'm sure you've heard like that's pretty popular, centering prayer. But the whole idea of centering prayer, you just go there and you sit. Like you're there with God. I use the image of, imagine your mother is in a senior's home and you're the dutiful daughter. You're living 5 miles away, and you go and you see her every night for an hour. During the course of the year, how many times you'll have an exciting conversation with her?
Uh-huh.
Most of the night you're going to talk about the weather, the sports team, what happened, the politics. Compare that to, you have a sister in Alaska who comes home once a year for a week. They do have deep conversations. They're hugging and crying, and you want to kill them both. But see what she has. That's not deeper. That's just that's the novice. That's the initiatory stuff. See, you're at a deeper level. John of the Cross says, at a certain time in your maturity, he said, the deep things happen under the surface. See, prior to that, they happen on the surface. Then they begin, and with God said, you just have to show up. These mystics say, the one rule about spirituality, just show up. And some days you're going to be consummately bored, you're looking at your wristwatch and so on. It's like visiting your mother in the senior's home.
I like that so much.
It's like the novice who goes into church and is crying. It's just wonderful to see Jesus, Keep going back for a while.
Yeah. You're a terrible marketer.
Yep.
By the way, this is horrible marketing for the church. I love it. It's like, you see what happens when you come back the 20th time. Boredom, also depth. There was something in your book that made me so angry. You were referring to an article that had been very popular about it's called The Drama of the Gifted Child. It was a description of the child who is sensitive, who maybe achieves out of knowing what people want, then perhaps grows up to be an embittered adult. Really thought that was quite the superhighway I have noticed recently of people who I know who feel very sympathetic and empathetic and are the person who shows up the 20th time, and yet are struggling a lot with who that has I guess like the burden of who that has made them.
Okay, let me get back to, actually, I'm a great fan of that book by Alice Miller. See, when she talks about the gift child, which is the sensitive child. You grow up, and because you're sensitive and you're not, as the British say, thick as a plank, you're absorbing some hurts, and you're said. And then, she's a neo-Freudian. She said once you be 35, your neurosis, overpowers some of your eros and energy. And I always tell students, when you're 40 years old, you realize your mother did love your sister better than you. No, but you don't necessarily get hard. See, that whole book said, but that has to be mourned. She says, see, then the drama of the gift child is, all those sensitivities and everything you've been hurt, and it starts to stir up,
Yeah.
But she says, the task of midlife and beyond, psychologically and spiritually, is mourning your losses,
Mm-hmm.
So, and then it'll soften. See, if you don't mourn your losses, then they'll harden. You're going to go to your deathbed saying, my mother did love my sister better than me. If you've grieved it, you can let it go. Basically, it's an invitation to grieve your hurts.
Yes.
And she said, if you mourn them, they'll turn soft, and you'll turn soft. If you don't mourn them, they're going to stay with you.
One thing that's been hard for me to land on is a level of honesty about my own, like really just not just like needs and wants, but like really in a way, the willingness to go against the grain and like break a cultural script about, our culture believes, for instance, that emotional self-mastery looks like a person that's happy all the time. A person that's happy all the time must be the best Christian, must be a capitalist winner, must be a wonderful, wife and mom, etc. And so I've really become more and more invested into trying to figure out what a grace-filled honesty looks like, as opposed to just me running around confronting everyone. And it reminds me of something my friend Nadia Bowles-Weber said one time about her experience in AA, that she didn't learn to be honest until she started practicing the kinds of honesty that people were doing in church basements as opposed to church sanctuaries. I wonder what I feel like you have a pitch for honesty, spiritual honesty.
Yeah. No, first of all, I'm sympathetic. It's hard, because our culture, we're not given permission to be honest. And I also agree that probably where we can learn really our culture spiritually is from 12-step programs, because they are completely predicated on honesty, and honesty is the healing. As long as you're not honest, and as long as you're denial or lying, there's no help. But I want to make a point here, which is something that's heavy on my mind right now. Talk about honesty, and that is our culture. See, we are coming into a culture of lies, and lying biblically with Jesus is the most dangerous sin of all. Satan is not the prince of sex or the prince of pride. Satan is the prince of lies. See, the danger with lies is we eventually believe our own lie. Like I always say, if there's somebody in hell, they're not there regretting their lives. They're feeling sorry for the idiots in heaven. And you get there by distortion, by lying, so that I think when they write the history of spirituality, America's contribution is going to be 12-step programs, because that's deep. They basically say that there is only one single thing you need. You need to stop lying. You need to, and like you said, our culture isn't giving that permission.
Yes.
You get permission if you go to an AA meeting or to a 12-step meeting. Otherwise, we're lying. We're lying.
Yes. I love the idea that one of the great contributions could be, especially in our culture of rampant disinformation, like what if we doubled down on being a culture of grace-filled truth-telling, that we worry that it'll take our souls apart if we don't practice telling the truth.
This is pointed out by a novelist. He said, like when you look at the original sin, quotation marks, notice, he said, how it could have been different if Adam and Eve had owned it after the fact, instead of saying, like, you ate the apple, well, it was her fault and I got tempted. If it had just said, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was, well, we have a little different history. You know what? See, right back to the first man and woman, we can't quite own our weakness and to tell the truth and so on. So Adam and Eve already, denial, well, it's not my fault. It's not my fault, I like that line. If they could have said, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I realized that was pretty stupid. But, I'm convinced that, and it's also, that's true in John's gospel. In John's gospel, Jesus is on you just don't lie. And if you don't lie, if you're honest, God's going to find you. God's going to find you. And if you lie, you're slipping away. And I think that's the great insight that's brought to us, spiritually by AA and those kinds of programs. See, in AA, it's clear. Until you're telling the raw, honest, naked truth, you're not going anywhere. You can't be healed, or you can't be helped.
I do like that because it does seem to align. There's been good things and bad things about the fact that we live in an overwhelmingly therapeutic culture. I mean, I think people imagine it's only good things, but there's been some tough things too. Or people, for instance, don't know that they're arguing something because they begin every sentence with "I feel." But that sounds like that's just a really good argument where we can agree, like, therapeutically and spiritually, that honesty can be at the foundation of like building or rebuilding who we are. And if we're in the wrong place, it could be the start of who we want to be. You have this really helpful framework for talking about how we could reconstitute a spiritual life that doesn't maybe feel so exhausting or dissonant. And it starts with actually making time to pray. It sounds funny to be like, Father Ron, can you pitch me on praying? But can you pitch me? What's so lovely about praying?
Well, some days it doesn't feel lovely at all. Annie Lamott?
Yes.
No, in one of her books. Okay.
Yes.
But I love this. So she tells a story about her son Samuel, when Samuel was a young kid. I took him to church and he loved it, and the people fussed over him, and then he gets to be like 14, 15, and he comes and says, Mom, I don't want to go to church anymore. And she says, why not? She said, it doesn't mean anything to me. Now, I love the answer she gave. He says, it doesn't mean anything. But she says, I couldn't give a shit whether it means anything to you. She said, that's a child's answer. He said, it doesn't have to mean anything to you. It means something in itself. He said, it's like visiting your grandmother. You don't visit your grandmother because it means something. It means something. That's a pretty good definition of maturity. See, the same with prayer. I don't go to prayer a lot of times because it feels good. You don't visit your mother because she's your mother. And I love that thing, and complete with Annie Lamott's color. Basically,
yes.
That's the way children talk. These things, they mean something in themselves. One of the old classic definitions of prayer, which I still like, they say, prayer is lifting mind and heart to God. But something? We seldom do that. We try to lift what we think God wants. So if you're at church, you're bored, sick, that's your mind and heart. You lift that to God. Mm-hmm. If you have a sexual temptation, you're lifting mind and heart to God. If you're angry with somebody, you lift mind and heart to God. That's why, for instance, the Psalms, if you read the Psalms, they bring in every emotion. I want to take my neighbor's kids and hit their heads against a rock, But see, for instance, you see the Psalms, they have every emotion in play. You want to murder somebody, Some days you want to praise, So I like the prayer. Prayer is lifting mind and heart to God. Whatever is in your mind when you go to church next, that's what you lift to God. And sometimes it's praise and wonderful, and sometimes I want to kill somebody.
I like how much murder. I like how much murder is in this podcast today. I wonder what you advise people who have been very hurt by the church. There's so much pain involved in the reality of people, actual communities. actual disappointment, brokenheartedness. How do we navigate the messiness of actual community when it's wounded us?
Yeah. Okay, you had about 3 dimensions to that question. That's a good question. Now, first of all, what I do is sometimes I give them an image, which, and that is to give themselves a time of convalescence. They like to say sometimes you need to be healed from your church. You have an operation or time of convalescence. So sometimes they can't go to church for a while. They can't, and it's not that you're rejecting Jesus or something, but you need convalescence. I'm sure you read this or the marvelous book by Rachel Held Evans, the one In Search of Sundays. Her and her husband for a time they couldn't go to a church. Or we have Catholics, hurt by the church or the sexual abuse crisis. A lot of times, or by patriarchy or something. I'll say, well, you need a period of convalescence. Then secondly, go where you're fed. Find a community. Find a community that feeds you. Don't necessarily go to a community that's going to beat you up and so on. But then with the warning to, but be careful also, find a community that challenges you and be prepared to live with some mess.
Yeah.
When people say today, for both good and for bad, they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. See, partly they're saying, I can deal with Jesus. I'm not sure I can deal with community, but see, we kind of have to deal with community at a point. But then also, respect yourself. Sometimes you're just too raw. You're just too tender. Say, this is not a time I can go back. I call that convalescence. And there's other times say, I'm stronger. I think I can take the bumps and the bruises now again.
Yeah, I like that.
But find a community. Sartre, the famous atheist, he once said, he says, hell is the other person. And I use that because the truth is exactly the opposite. Hell is complete aloneness.
Yeah.
But you don't want to be cut off from family, from community, from somebody, Stay with the group. That's a good question. That's a real one,
Yeah, there's so much, historically speaking, it's just been a bit since we've seen really good news for an exciting way that is gathering people. We've had a lot of X this and X that because of the disappointment that people have had. And so I think people are really looking right now in particular of a way of being energized without having to go back to some of the same kinds of patterns of hurt and often a certain model of charismatic authority, just a certain kind of strong leader that actually ended up not being a leader at all. Yeah. I love the way that you describe looking at the ache, looking at the incompleteness, and then pulling us towards something that is deeper and truer in a way that reconstitutes us in our relationship to God and also to other people, to look at it and declare it good. I thank you so much for your gentle wisdom, for your willingness to answer this many questions, and just your now official acceptance of our lifelong friendship. This has been an absolute joy.